Today we're looking at sine and cosine in the same right triangle, just a special situation that happens sometimes in right triangles. And we want to connect sine and cosine in the same right triangle. That's our goal for today. So just a quick refresher, cosine is the adjacent divided by hypotenuse. Sine is the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. So we looked at class today at what is sine of 55. Well, I know sine using SOHCAHTOA is opposite divided by hypotenuse. So the opposite side is d, the hypotenuse is n. So sine 55 equals d over n. And then cosine of 55 is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the adjacent side to 55 is e, and the hypotenuse is still n. So e over n. So those are the sine and cosine of 55. Now, what if I looked at sine of 35 and cosine of 35? Well, sine of 35 is the opposite, which is e, divided by the hypotenuse, which is n. Now, maybe you're noticing we just did that up here. So the sine of 35 is equal to the cosine of 55. Interesting. Now let's look at the cosine of 35, the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. Well, cosine of 35 is d over n. So the big idea we took away from this is that the sine of 55 is equal to the cosine of 35. And vice versa. The cosine of 55 is equal to the sine of the 35. They're just like the opposite. Why does this happen? Well, if I'm looking at angle 55, this is my opposite. This is the hypotenuse. If I'm looking at cosine of 35, this is my adjacent, and this is my hypotenuse. So the opposite over hypotenuse for 55 is the same thing as the adjacent over the 50 or the hypotenuse for the 35. So it's just the same thing when we look at different angles. The sine of one angle is equal to the cosine of the other angle. That's really all that's happening. So our notes today was the sine of one angle is equal to the cosine of 90 minus the angle. Now, what does that mean? That looks confusing. Let's explain that. Sine of the angle. Let's just say this angle was 20 degrees. So sine of 20 is equal to the cosine of the other angle. Now, what is the other angle? Well, 90 and 20 is 110. So I know this angle has got to be 110 minus 180, which is 70. Another way to figure that out, if this one's 20, we know that we already have 90 for this right triangle. So we have 90 degrees left. So let's take 90 minus 20, we get 70. So 90 minus theta is just this angle minus 90 degrees to figure out using the triangle sum theorem. That's all that's happening there. So sine of one angle is equal to cosine of the other angle. These are called complementary angles, two angles that have a sum of 90 degrees. So for example, if this angle is 65, this angle is 25 because they got to add up to 90, because 90 plus another 90 would equal 180 for a right triangle. So those are just called complementary angles. So we talked about sine of one angle equals cosine of the other one. If I had an example like this, sine of 55 is equal to the cosine of what angle? Well, if I have a right triangle and I have a 55 degree angle here, the sine of this angle, let's just call this side x, let's call this side y. Sine of 55 is x over y, because the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. So what would be the cosine equal to? Well, we need to just know this other angle. I know these two angles have to add up to 90 degrees. So 90 minus 55 is 35 degrees. So the angle that is missing here is 35 degrees. That's it. Because cosine of 35 for this one is the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, or x over y. It is the exact same thing as cos 35.